Beautiful. And again, welcome everybody to the Law for Black Lives and BYP 100 Black Queer Feminism webinar. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes and just asking folks who are new to go ahead and go on mute. Beautiful. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everyone so much for spending your Monday evening with us. This is the Law for Black Lives and BYP 100 webinar on Black Queer Feminism. And we're super excited. This is part of a 3-part series that Law for Black Lives is hosting around foundational politics. And so this will be the first webinar. The second will be on March 19th about abolition. And then we'll have one in April on anti-capitalism. And for us, the idea was just to ground folks in what we see as foundational politics that really drive both our movement and our movement lawyering practice. And so we're super excited to have an incredible panel of folks discussing the Black Queer Feminist lens and the frame and what that actually means for our everyday work and practices. And so thank you all again for joining us. Just some quick background. Law for Black Lives is a network of about 4,000 lawyers and legal workers across the country committed to building the power and the scope of Black liberation movements. And so we're super honored to work with partners across the country who are doing policy and organizing work to really build out a vision for all of our futures. Our main goals are to transform the legal field away from a gatekeeping model into a model of liberation where we're supporting the power of organizing, and also to support base building groups across the country through the building of an agile and flexible and radical legal infrastructure. Just some tips for our webinar tonight. I think it is best enjoyed with headphones on in terms of sound quality. We're also going to ask for folks to stay on mute throughout the webinar unless we have a question and answer session, in which case you can unmute to ask a question. Also, if you have questions throughout the webinar, you're welcome to put them in the chat box. Both the speakers and the panelists and the moderator will all be able to see and read those questions and hopefully incorporate them into their statements. So we're super excited to be co-hosting this webinar with one of the kind of leading organizations across the country, both in terms of Black organizing, but also the Black Queer Feminist lens. And so we have one of the co-directors of that organization, 100, Janae Bonsu, joining us tonight to moderate this incredible panel. Janae is a Chicago-based organizer who comes from Columbia, South Carolina by way of Brooklyn. And she now lives and builds in Chicago. Janae is super honored to serve as the national co-director of BYP 100, so shout out to that. And it's also, which is a national member-based organization for folks between the ages of 18 to 35 that organizes using a Black queer feminist lens. She's also a PhD candidate where she focuses on the relationship between Black women's experiences of interpersonal violence and state violence. And it's just a real resource and a brilliant kind of luminary for the movement around thinking about how do we actually apply in our daily lives, in our practice and our organizing Black queer feminism. So I'm going to pass it to Janae, and again, just thank everybody so much for joining us and encourage you to sign up for our remaining webinars addressing anti-capitalism and abolition. So Janae, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you, Marbre, and welcome everyone to this webinar. As Marbre said, my name is Janae Bonsu, National Co-Director at BYP 100, and I'm really excited to break down what working and organizing through a Black queer feminist means and what it looks like through this powerhouse of a panel. Everyone on this panel I'm honored to have and continue to learn from. And so I am excited to introduce first off Charlene Carruthers. Charlene is a strategist, a writer, a leading community organizer in today's movement for Black liberation. She's the founder of the Chicago Center for Leadership and Transformation and author of Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements. We also have Cathy Cohen, who is a professor at the University of Chicago and the former director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. Dr. Cohen is the recipient of numerous awards, including 2 major research grants from the Ford Foundation for her work as the principal investigator of the Black Youth Project and the Mobilization, Change, and Political and Civic Engagement Project. Dr. Cohen is the co-editor with Frederick Harris of a book series entitled Transgressing Boundaries, Studies in Black Politics and Black Communities. Dr. Cohen was also a founding board member and former co-chair of the board of the Audre Lorde Project in New York, and has served as an active member in the Black Radical Congress, African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, and Ella's Daughters. He's also the founder of the Black Youth Project, which is a website devoted to Black youth. We also have Andrea Ritchie, who is a Black queer feminist attorney, advocate, researcher, and organizer, whose work is focused on policing and criminalization of Black women, girls, queer, and trans people for over 20 years. She is currently a researcher in residence with the Interrupting Criminalization Research and Action Initiative at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. And there she partners with organizations around the country challenging police violence and criminalization. And she is a member of the M4BL policy table. She's the author of Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, and is also the co-author of Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women and Queer Injustice, the Criminalization of LGBTQ People in the United States. And last but certainly not least, we have Raquel Willis, who is a Black queer transgender activist, writer, and speaker. She is currently the executive editor of Out Magazine. In 2018, she was named a Jack Jones Literary Arts Sylvia Rivera Fellow. She's also a part of the Echoing Ida, a national Black women and non-binary writers collective. She's a former national organizer for Transgender Law Center, and she launched the Black Trans Circles, which is a project focused on developing the leadership of Black trans women in the South and Midwest by creating healing justice spaces to work through oppression-based trauma, incubating community organizing efforts to address anti-trans murder and violence, and elevating nuanced narratives through a national storytelling campaign. Born and raised in Augusta, Georgia, Raquel is a thought leader on gender, race, and intersectionality. So as you can see, we have a panel of experts here that is gonna help us break down what is Black queer feminism, what is intersectionality. So without further ado, I'm gonna get into it. So I'm gonna start with you, Charlene. Your recent book, Unapologetic, Black Queer Feminist and Mandate for Radical Social Movements, is a really, really powerful must read to ground organizers in a particular politic of movement building. So could you share what your definition of Black queer feminism is? And is that synonymous with intersectionality? Are they the same thing? And how is it different than other iterations of feminism?
Cool. So first, I'll just start by saying, super, super grateful for the opportunity to join this conversation tonight. It's an amazing group of people, and really grateful for the opportunity. We spent in BYP 100 about, I don't know how many years, 2-3 years, I think, before we ever started to write anything down to really define and hone in what we meant by the Black queer feminist lens. And so as I was writing this book, which took me about maybe 3 or 4 years to finish writing, from start to end, I was like, I am going to write how I understand this thing so that it can be useful for other people. And so I believe that if you don't understand how to describe something in the story, then you really don't understand like the framework. And so the Black queer feminist lens for me is about how do you apply organizing a set of ideas and also a set of practices to how you go about doing movement building work. So really plainly, organizing through a Black queer feminist lens means that you can meet any young Black person on the street. You recognize who they are, what their experiences are through actually building a real public relationship with them. And then through this work, you can actually move with them through a journey to broaden how they understand Black liberation, who Black liberation is for, who's been left out, and the way that we should approach the work. And so the Black Queer Feminist lens is really about grounding ourselves in Black radical traditions, Black LGBT and Black feminist traditions, and applying that to our ideas about the world as it should be, and applying that to how we treat each other, who we think should be at the table, looking around and seeing who isn't at the table, and pairing both what we think and what we do together. It's really a politic that is both aspirational and something that, in my view, can't be perfect. It can't be perfected, but it's something that we can move through. And I don't think it's adversarial to intersectionality. As I understand intersectionality, it's a framework for how you can understand the conditions in which Black women experience multiple systems of oppression. Like, that's my foundational understanding of intersectionality. And so the Black Queer Feminist lens takes the understanding of intersectionality, right, a framework, and says, and adds it to many other traditions within the Black radical tradition, or many other sets of knowledges and practices, and says, I am going to put on this pair of glasses, or these set of lenses over my eyes, over my life and how I do the work, and apply that to it. So just like a pair of sunglasses, a pair of glasses that I have on right now, the Black Queer Feminist lens changes the way that we do our work. And it impacts the way that we do our work, so that we can actually further not just our ideas, but also our actions for collective liberation. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And something that you've said that's always stuck with me is that if we don't tell complete stories, then we won't have complete solutions. And that kind of gets at this notion of a Black queer feminist lens that means we have to be vigilant in focusing our methods, our stories, our solutions, right, on those who society deems most deviant and most undeserving of justice, so that we can all be free. So that's definitely something I've appreciated from you. And given that, just thinking about who society deems most deviant and undeserving of justice, I want to turn to you, Cathy. You've written a lot about the radical potential of queer politics and deviance as resistance. Your writing has been foundational to many of our understandings of Black queer feminism and intersectionality. So can you share how you think these concepts have evolved over your career, and anything that you would add onto what Charlene's offered us in defining this?
Well, first of all, let me, like Charlene, thank everyone for participating in this. I'm excited to be here with comrades who I'm going to learn from tonight. And I guess I want to agree with Charlene in the sense of, I think of a kind of radical queer politic as aspirational. But I do think it has changed over time, and I'll try to be brief. But for me, the idea of a radical queer politic was really about power, right? It was never about identity, and I'll get to that in a minute. It was about trying to understand the complexity of people's relationship to power. And it really came out of a moment when many of us were organizing around HIV and AIDS, in particular in New York, and hearing white gay men create a dichotomy between them and what they would say were kind of heterosexuals who had power. And the thing was I lived in community, I had family, where I knew that there were, in particular, poor Black women who I was related to, who had less power than many of the white gay men that were kind of dominating the scene in terms of some of the HIV and AIDS work. And so for me, the radical potential of queer was about how do we understand our relationship to state power on lots of different levels, right? To not understand, in fact, kind of the creation of, and the reproduction of white supremacy, the ways in which white men often had insurance, the ways in which their sickness could be recognized, all of those issues as having power. And so somehow separating themselves as heterosexuals were all powerful and folks who identified as LGBT were not, seemed problematic and idiotic, right? And so for I think many of us, the question became, how do we work in coalition and build radical coalitions in relationship to state power. So how do we take women who were struggling to kind of make ends meet? How do you take Black gay folks who were trying to deal with issues of HIV and homophobia and heterosexism in our own communities? How do you take folks who were kind of laboring just to make kind of enough money through a kind of absurd racial capitalist system? And how do we build a coalition of folks who understood that they all had less power or no power or little power relative to kind of dominant state power or capitalist power? And that was always kind of the radical potential of queer, because if we think about kind of queer from its beginning, it really was not about supposedly an identity. It was about the ways in which there was fluidity in how we decided who we loved, what we did, and how we performed gender and sexuality. How has it evolved over time? Very quickly, I'm sorry. It's, you know, it's both good and bad for me, right? Which is that I think increasingly people identify as queer. And I think it becomes difficult, therefore, to build a coalition, and I'd love to hear what other people think about this, to build a coalition about relative state power when I own an identity, when I am queer, so to speak. And so that has been kind of part of the evolution. When I first wrote Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, I talk about this all the time. To me, it was a provocation because most Black, LGBT, trans folks didn't want to identify as queer. So we could talk about it as a kind of a framework of unity. And now it's just very different. I think the same thing as Charlene said, when many of us started using intersectionality to think about it as a kind of a space of understanding the ways in which systems of oppression are compounded in the lives of Black women, that's how we understood intersectionality. It has now kind of grown to represent lots of different positions of the compounding of systems of oppression. And I think for some people, that feels uncomfortable because it seems to flatten or make equivalent all systems of oppression and not understand the kind of significance of grounding it with Black women. So I think, you know, these concepts are helpful for us, or for me, in thinking about questions of power and our relationship to power. But the thing is that they grow and they change over time because people take hold of them and have a different vision of what they want to do with the idea of queer or power or feminism or even Black feminism.
Ooh, there's a lot there.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. This is juicy because now we're complicating this idea of queerness, not just as an identity or, you know, like, or a sexual identity, but like in its relationship to power. I think that's super important. And I'm curious to see if Charlene, you have something that you want to add to that before we shift gears a little bit.
Yeah, first, yes, Cathy. And one of the things that's super important to me to note is that just because you identify as a part of any number of marginalized groups, be it Black, woman, queer, lesbian, trans, disabled, undocumented, any of these things, it doesn't mean that you're radical. It doesn't mean that you have a set of politics. It doesn't mean that you are about collective liberation of all people. It's a choice. It's a choice, and it actually takes more than just what you think. It really takes what you do, whatever that is. There's not one way to be an organizer besides a commitment to developing leaders. I will stand by, I'm very firm on that. And there's no one way to just take action, right? I don't think there's a hierarchy of ways to take action by any means, whatever way that you're able to do that. But I think that speaks to what Cathy is saying around queerness evolving into an identity. And I think it has social cues to it, all kinds of things that don't necessarily like go in line with any set of political values. And that's sad and disappointing in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I just really quick before I go to the next question, just want to remind folks on the call, if you have questions, to please drop them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. And please remember to keep yourselves on mute. I know folks have added in or dropped in since we started. And so I actually want to turn to Raquel now. If you could share your thoughts about the importance of Black queer feminism personally and politically, and what it's meant for your work, particularly as a strategic communicator.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, so I'll also start off and just say thank you to everyone for being here and being present for this conversation. Thank you to Charlene and Cathy for really kicking things off. And also thank you to Andrea, who's coming up as well. Yeah, so the importance for me around Black queer feminism really is that it has provided an opportunity for me to explain really so many aspects of my life and so many aspects, I think, of the different struggles that I've encountered as a Black transgender queer woman just throughout my life. And also, I think what has complicated things is that if it's not clear to a lot of people when it comes to being trans or being queer, often we experience shifting of identities, right? And so we see kind of the ways that privilege and power can be kind of shaky and much messier than what I often call the binary of privilege versus oppression, right? Because the idea really is that we all kind of experience both of those things in various shades at different points throughout our lives, right? We aren't just simply an oppressed person or simply a privileged person. When I first encountered Black queer feminism, I really encountered it in different components. I confronted, I guess, feminism and gender in college and sexual orientation in college, but it didn't really have kind of a root in Blackness, right? And kind of this radical Blackness that I've really gained from my organizing experience. And so I do struggle with the inaccessibility of theory and what that means for our people. And that's why I'm so thankful for BYP 100 and people like Charlene, Cathy, Andrea, who have so greatly contributed to producing, that theory and also sharing it and figuring out ways to share it with our people. The other thing I'll say when it comes to Blackness, I think that we often miss the opportunity to embrace the expansiveness of Blackness. And in my opinion, I think Blackness is actually inherently gender nonconforming. So I feel that particularly in a US Western context, also in a Christian context, a lot of times, there's this idea that there's kind of this one particular way to be a man or to be masculine or to be a woman or be feminine or even to blur the two. And that's not necessarily true and not necessarily organic to our beings. And so I think the opportunity that we have as Black people who have access to this language, access to this theory, is that we can really figure out what that means on our own terms and figure out what liberation means for our people outside of those contexts that have been built around us. And then the other thing I'll say is that with strategic communication, I am particularly grateful to be in social justice spaces and in organizing spaces, because that's what holds me accountable in a way that I think maybe other journalists are not held accountable or other writers may not be held accountable, right? And I'm sure Charlene also has similar feelings too, but I'm grounded in using communication and writing as a means for liberation. So when I was in journalism school and I was learning about objectivity, right, and learning about how basically we shed all of these layers of our identities and kind of dilute ourselves so that other people can hear, so it can be mass produced, right, and mass disseminated. None of that ever really felt true to me and true to the people that I know. I do have an agenda, right? Even as a writer, even as a journalist. And my agenda is the liberation of marginalized people, Black people, queer and trans people. And it doesn't matter what story that I'm trying to share or get out into the world, I have to be true to that. And so, for instance, I think of this story where The Guardian actually published this piece about a Black trans woman living in Georgia. And they just kind of published it with no kind of concept around how that would impact her life, right? And so when they published the piece, and she was young, so she also didn't have this idea of how that would so greatly impact her life, you know, this major platform sharing all of her inner thoughts about her identity. She was disowned by her family, right? And so really within like a few weeks, she was dealing with the tensions of her family not being okay with that and being homeless and needing support from community. And I really think if someone from the community actually covered her and not like a white, wealthy cis man, it could have been a much smoother, more nuanced rollout when her story came out. And so I think of that, right? That just as I have the power, particularly in my new position at Out, to elevate stories, I also have to understand that with that power, again, comes great responsibility for my communities and the people impacted.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And turning to Andrea now, amongst so many other things, you are also an attorney, you're a lawyer. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what you think Black queer feminism has to do with the law, how that has showed up for you in your practice.
Thanks for the question, but also for the opportunity to be in conversation with my Black feminist queeros across the board. And I'm just so grateful for this community of folks who have really helped me think about that question and so many others. I think the short answer to what Black queer feminism has to do with the law is kind of nothing and everything at the same time. You know, I came to law school a Black queer feminist, and yes, not just in the sense of the identity. I wasn't just a Black queer feminist who was at law school, but someone who had been organizing from a Black queer feminist stance in relation to the state, in environmental justice movements, in movements for gender justice, workers' rights, and LGBTQ rights, and against police violence. And so Black queer feminism really shaped how I understood the law and its limitations, and really were the glasses I was wearing from the moment I walked into law school, and why I walked into law school, in terms of kind of understanding the role of the law in establishing and maintaining, rather than providing any kind of redress or relief for the interlocking systems of oppression that Black queer feminism highlights, and the role of the law in facilitating and promoting the kind of matrix of violence that Beth Ritchie talks about Black women living within, and girls and trans and gender nonconforming people. And then sort of really seeing through, as you learn more about the law, its complete inability to recognize Black women's, trans and gender nonconforming people's stories at all. And that, you know, it sort of comes at it with the people's experience with this really blunt knife, right? It's like you either experience discrimination based on race, and then there's one legal standard, or gender, another legal standard, or sexuality, it's another legal standard, or ability, or nationalism, and all of those things converge in Black bodies, and there's an inability to recognize them, and then complete inability to recognize gender identity, transness, and Blackness in the ways that Raquel just described it, as inherently gender nonconforming and inherently outside the law. And so, and at the same time, it's really an enforcer of all of the interlocking systems of oppression. For me, the work looking particularly at its role as enforcer of these systems of oppression through policing. So I was able to really think about the controlling narratives, the stories about Black women and girls and trans people that Black feminism helps us understand, that are rooted in and promote and enable the systems of oppression and power to exist, and how they operate through the law in individual police encounters that are sort of hidden in these like neutral legal terms, like what is reasonable suspicion, what is probable cause. It's like a Black woman standing on a corner and a white woman standing on a corner, is read two different ways. One is seen as probable cause of engaging in prostitution, and the other is seen as waiting for a bus, right? And that is a way in which the law operates that's not visible to itself or legible to itself, but that very much Black queer feminism helps us understand how those systems of power are enforced in kind of the most routine and mundane, whether it's like police decisions, court decisions, judge decisions, jury decisions, and just kind of the operation of these neutral standards or supposedly neutral standards of law. So I think for me, that's been critical to surviving law school and to understanding the law, and most of all, not understanding how to reduce the harm of the law within the system, but also the necessity of continuing Black queer feminist challenges to systems of power outside the law, and just recognizing that it's really important to understand it to better to resist it.
Thank you for that. And just really quickly, you mentioned the matrix of violence, or violence matrix, in reference to Beth Ritchie. If you could just say really briefly what that is for folks who might not know.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, the Beth Ritchie sort of has, in her book, Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence in the Prison Nation, I think it's a subtitle. I always get the order of those confused, but has like basically a chart, okay? And it's like Black women are experiencing, and girls and trans and gender nonconforming people are experiencing violence in the home, in the community, in the labor market, and from the state, and those all facilitate and enable each other. And so it's a way of seeing literally a web in which Black women, girls, and gender nonconforming people are existing, that is of violence from all ends and all angles. And that and the controlling narratives, which are just is another word for stories that get told about Black women, girls, trans and gender nonconforming people, promiscuous, deceitful, bad mothers, disease spreaders, et cetera, that are rooted in slavery and continue to take new forms, new shapes, like welfare queen and so on, are the stories that inform the way laws are enforced within this matrix of violence. And, Black queer feminism gives us all that way of understanding the law, such that we don't fall into traps of thinking that the law is going to save us, when the law is actually set up to literally form the bars around that matrix and push us into it.
Right.
I just want to lift up also, sorry, before I get stop, what Raquel was saying about how we tell stories too. And I think that it's so important, and it's such a responsibility and accountability, I feel, as a writer and also as a person who's operating in the legal world, that as we do this work, it's important to undermine those stories and to tell our stories in their full complexity, even when the legal system is telling us not to.
I should to that. And I want to kick it back to Charlene. Can you please talk about just what has been grounded in Black queer feminism meant for you personally and for your political organizing? Just like, what are some examples of just like practices, just policies or rituals that embracing Black queer feminism has meant for you in your work?
I think that's a great question. And in more ways than one, it really means like, if I claim to believe in something, I actually need to do it. Like, I don't, like, it may sound simple, but like once you, and I talk about this in the book, it's like, in some ways I think I set myself up, BYP 100 sets itself up for a certain set of expectations, that once you say you have this set of values, that when and if my actions don't align with that, then that's something to hold me accountable to. And particularly the people I'm actually in a relationship with, not some like random person, because organizing is so much about what I believe to be like amongst like the smallest units of organizing are actually our relationships with other people. And so working through Black queer feminist lens is really about constant self-work, constant interrogation, constantly being open to being sharpened by other people and being willing and not liberal in sharpening other folks as well. And so it means that when I hear about something that has happened, either, I guess like in an organizing context, right? A conflict that exists. It's about how do I actually respond to that thing, and how do, like, it requires me to really think about, or it has required me to think about being proactive and not just reactive to things. And some folks might hear this and say, oh, that applies to a lot of things that I think, or a lot of things that I do. But really, Kimberly Springer wrote a book about Black feminist movements. And I see someone in the chat box ask about book recommendations. And in the book, she talks about how Black women were the first people in the United States, this colonized land, to organize and make demands along the lines of race, class, and gender. And so I think it's just embedded in in so many social justice traditions, and it has deep roots in like Black women's, Black feminist movements, and both in thought and in action. And in more ways than one, has been co-opted, erased, overlooked, all kinds of things. But to really dig into what Cathy is saying about power, that this is fundamentally an issue, power is a fundamental factor in all of these things. It is also about constantly interrogating how I am using power, how I'm deploying power in my work relationships, in my personal relationships, in my family, how I treat the people who serve me food in restaurants, like the people who like all those things. Like, how do I talk to people? Because if I'm talking to folks in a way and treating people in a way that is like power over folks as opposed to power with, then that's actually not living out my politics, my values. It's just not. So that's how it shows up. And that doesn't mean I'm perfect. It means that, like, girl, you got to like actually walk the walk or make the move that you say that you talk about. And so that's so much of that. And I see somebody talking about the inaccessibility of theory. I'll make one quick note about that, is that there's also an article that Bell Hooks wrote, maybe I'll get it before the end of this call, about theory. And the way I understand theory is that it is a set of ideas to explain something. And that people, based on their various positions of power, have used sets of ideas to explain things in ways that are through incomplete or just flawed, skewed, and dangerous stories, right? And that then leads us to making flawed, incomplete, or experiencing, right, really terrible things as people, and developing or having to live under really terrible strategies and really terrible policies and plans. And so doing my work through a Black queer feminist lens requires me to constantly question. And I actually think I learned that in the 3rd grade and from my teachers, the Black women who taught me critical thinking, my mom, my parents, my dad, and the Black women who taught me in school to be a critical thinker. So that plays so much into how I live in the world.
Thank you for that, Charlene. There's a lot there. And I know you want to jump in on this, Cathy, particularly around power. And you started to talk about this already, but what does Black queer feminism have to do with power and building power? And if you could also, in addition to that, just tell us a bit more about some of the work that you've done with the Black Youth Project and Naji Lord project as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of like, as Charlene was talking, which is often how I feel, I was like, yes, yes, yes. And then I was like, okay, but I want to go. She said a couple things that I think are really important. And I want to take us back to power and thinking about kind of what does it mean to be grounded in a Black feminist lens. I feel like it means that we have to kind of look for power everywhere, including within Blackness, right? So it means, for me, when I look at kind of BYP 100, when I think about the work of the Movement for Black Lives, what I see is people who love, I say this all the time, people who love the margins of Blackness, right? Like who love the people who are struggling, the people who are thought to be kind of deviant, the people who, in fact, I think make up the complexity and challenge us to think differently and expansively, as Raquel said, about Blackness, right? And I think if a Black queer feminist lens should be located right there, right, on the margins, and our analysis then springs from that. Right? What does liberation look like for folks, many of us, who are sort of kind of in the margins, but not on the margins, right? And it means, of course, a liberation from kind of a dominant systems of white supremacy. It means thinking about dominant power, but it also means paying attention to the ways in which power gets executed and deployed even within Black communities, right? It means thinking about and having people prove their solidarity and not assuming solidarity, right? So to me, it is about, it has to be about kind of thinking about power and understanding positionality, but understanding that positionality is not the same as consciousness or liberation, right? So people can be positioned outside of power, but it doesn't mean that they're willing to act from that position towards liberation and to have a consciousness that's about liberation. And to me, that's the work, right, of a Black queer, there are a lot of Black queer feminist politics. It is understanding folks' positionality, but moving them towards liberation, or kind of creating an infrastructure in which they move towards liberation, right? And so not confusing positionality with liberation or consciousness. So, okay, so real quick, the Black Youth Project, for example, to me is about the difference between positionality and consciousness in terms of its construction. It started as a kind of radical research project where we wanted to detail how young Black people thought about the world. We wanted to kind of center their voices. We wanted to describe the kind of systems of oppression that they encountered. We wanted to kind of do this from an intersectional frame, right? And that was, I think, about detailing the systems of power and the positionality of far too many young Black folks. But after doing that work as a research project, the question became, how do you provide an infrastructure towards liberation? And I think that is the other work that folks do through the BYP. It is the writing, it is the activism, it is the ability to kind of say this is how young people are positioned, but also to make sure that we're centering voices and their understanding and their analysis. So for me, the BYP is an example of, again, a Black queer feminist project in the sense of who is it centered around? Does it have an analysis of power? Absolutely. Does it try to kind of shift power so that those folks who are most marginal have an opportunity to speak for themselves? Yes. Can we leverage the resources of institutions to provide people with resources to do the type of political work that they want to do? Yes. If we can do all that, then to me, it's a kind of Black queer feminist project. And I think that very quickly, that was the same thing that we saw when we were trying to start the Audre Lorde Project in New York. First of all, there was already an LGBT center. There still is. I think it's in Chelsea. It's on 13th. It used to be. I don't know if it's still there. But, and we could all go there, but that wasn't home. Home was in Brooklyn. Home was among Black people, right? It is an intersectional approach to who we were. We weren't just like gay folks who wanted to be in the village. We wanted to be with our people. So to do that, you had to build an institution that was different. You had to build an institution that, of course, recognized us as kind of queer subjects, but also was down to kind of take up the fight around police brutality, even though that person didn't seem to be quote unquote queer. I would argue they are, because in fact, they're on the outside of dominant power, right? So I think the Audre Lorde Project was another example of people saying, you have to see, as Charlene just talked about, the complexity of who I am. I'm going to build an institution that represents all of who I am, that can service as many of our needs as possible, but that also provides a space where, in fact, we can work together jointly to build something bigger than we would if we just had an analysis around a kind of single identity. And I think that's the work of Black queer feminism. So there you go. I'm done.
Wow. Y'all are also brilliant. Oh my goodness. Okay. So being that, Law for Black Lives is, co-host of this, and I'm sure there are people who work within the legal field on this call. So I want to come back to you, Andrea. You started to explain what Black queer feminism has to do with the law generally, but if you could think specifically about some examples in your legal work and organizing where being grounded in Black queer feminist in a Black queer feminist lens has changed how you practice the law or understand cases. Can you just give us some demonstrative examples of that?
Sure. I mean, Black queer feminism is literally shapes everything I do and literally set me on the path of the work I've been doing over the past 20 years. I started working on police violence against Black women after reading Angela Davis's essay on violence, women and violence, I think, in which she said, if you care about violence against women, then I'm not sure why you're not caring about state violence against people like Eleanor Bumpurs, who had recently been shot by the police in New York City. And so for me, Black queer feminism has pointed me to seeing Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people as subjects and theorists and leaders around issues of policing and state violence, and to see Black women's experiences of policing, both as we commonly understand it and the specifics and the unique forms and ways in which Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people experience policing, and the role of policing in enforcing not only the lines of race and class, but also of racialized gender, and the ways in which policing is about controlling racially gendered bodies, our labor, our sexuality, our reproduction, our family, and our existence in public spaces. And so that's really shaped my organizing, the cases I organize around, the things I write about, the things I'm kind of generally agitating about. And it's also shaped my legal work. So, I've brought cases that have highlighted some of those things. The first case I brought coming out of law school was around challenging, this is Black feminism tells you to dream big and go big right out the box. So I graduated law school and filed a lawsuit against the nation's largest police department, challenging their practice of searching people to assign gender. And other and sexual harassment and violence by police and other forms of gender-based violence by police as a pattern and practice of that police department, not just as an individual thing that happened to my client, but as something that the police department did as a matter of practice, which led to widespread changes in NYPD policy. And then my Black queer feminist self learned that, that didn't actually change the way the policing played out on the ground, right? So it changed things on paper, but not necessarily in reality. I also was able to bring additional impact litigation that got was the first court opinion that found that discrimination based on gender identity is entitled to a heightened level of scrutiny. That's something that we need to look at in kind of the same way that we look at discrimination based on gender. So that was a kind of intervention on how the law sees gender identity in relation to gender. And I think the impact case that I did that has the most relevance to this conversation, and Cathy, you can go get a cup of coffee because you've heard this story 8 million times, but was working with Women with a Vision in New Orleans and the Center for Constitutional Rights to bring a challenge to a law that criminalized solicitation of a crime against nature, which basically means offering oral or anal sex for money or something of value. And there was a whole strategy for challenging that, because what the consequence of that conviction was not just that was a felony, sort of a general prostitution charge is a misdemeanor that carried a maximum sentence of 5 years, but also that upon conviction, you would be required to register as a sex offender for 15 years to life. And that would be emblazoned across your driver's license, and think about all the places you have to show your driver's license. And the way in which that law was enforced, you can imagine, by just understanding the law through Black queer feminist classes, as Charlene was saying. That in a society where Black women's sexuality is deemed inherently deviant, whether queer in identity or sexual practice or not, whether trans in identity or sexual practice or not, the 90% of the people who were on the sex offender registry for this offense were Black women, including Black trans women and some Black and men of color, gay men of color. And, you know, when I was talking to one of my clients about the case and how we were going to frame the case and the theory of the case, she was a cisgender heterosexual woman who was involved in the drug trade and the sex trade. And I was trying to say, well, how does this law play out? Who does it play out against? And she said, you know who they arrest on this charge? They arrest Black women, gay men, and trans women. And she said, you know, we're all queer out here. And that to me is an example, one, of how queerness relates to the state, but also an example of how theory is not inaccessible. Black queer feminist theory was elaborated by people at the margins. And people at the margins can articulate what Cathy Cohen said, you know, eloquently in an article called, you know, Punks, Bull Daggers, and Welfare Queens. But this was my sister at the margins struggling to survive who was able to break that down in one sentence. So that's the kind of case I brought. And I just want to say each of those cases, when I brought them, people were like, you aren't going to win that case. And, you know, one intern I worked with me called my law practice Lost Causes LLC. He was just like, you bring cases that are just ridiculous. And I won every single one of those. And so I think Black queer feminism also tells us to face power with boldness and rooted in community. Each of those cases was very much a community case. It was very accountable to communities. It was very rooted in the experiences of people who were experiencing that. And it's just made me practice, even not in impact litigation, but in individual practice, in ways that center the policing of Black women's bodies and the ways in which Black women's bodies and girls and trans and gender nonconforming people's bodies are seen and perceived by the law. So whether I represented 3 young Black girls who were beaten by police who claimed that they were involved in some kind of gang activity, while calling them Shaniqua, right? Like explaining that to a judge and explaining how all the interlocking oppressions and controlling narratives are playing out in that police beating was not an easy task, but it was one that I felt needed to happen. The same, I remember standing in front of an older white judge trying to explain what the case was about when I was representing a Black trans woman who was walking down the street, got jumped by the cops, and fought back because she thought she was being kidnapped and experiencing a homophobic attack. And he was like, well, but if she's trans, why was she worried about, like, trying to explain to the judge a Black trans woman's experience and then explain why the police thought the 9 condoms they found in her purse were evidence that she was engaged in prostitution and why that wasn't the case and why that was a way that probable cause was being applied that was about controlling narratives. Trying to make her experience legible in a court. And then lastly, organizing with, you know, the Audre Lorde Project around the beating of 2 Black lesbians outside a club where the cops, instead of using the usual slurs, were beating them and calling them dyke ass bitches, right? And so how do you make that visible to the law and make the law respond to and provide redress to those experiences? And then the last thing I'll say is that it shaped how, when I'm doing policy work around policing and doing it really as a harm reduction strategy and always trying to think, am I advancing a reformist reform or a non-reformist reform? Am I building the systems that are oppressing Black women and girls and trans and gender nonconforming people, or am I tearing them down a little bit by little bit? And that's a question I have to keep asking myself, but also always looking at them through the lens of the complexity of our experiences. So if we're going to fight about use of force policies, why are we not fighting about use of force against pregnant people? Why are we not fighting about sexual violence by police? Why are we not thinking about all the different ways that Black women experience profiling and all the different places they experience profiling and all the different ways it goes down? So that's how it shaped my legal work.
That's super helpful. And just really quick, if you could just tell us, what is a reformist reform and a non-reformist reform?
A reformist reform is one that doesn't question the legitimacy of the system and doesn't undermine systems of violence, and one that actually builds the system that is causing the problem. So where I have this fight with myself often is around, what do we do about sexual violence by police, right? Because often we're sort of arguing for, well, more policies and more prevention and more, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But when police are sexual violence, when you're arguing for that stuff, are you really just trying to build the legitimacy of the police, putting more money and resources into the police, creating systems that then will be used against us? or are we reducing harm of the police while we're about the business of abolishing them? And I think in that setting, it can go either way. And those are questions I ask myself all day, every day.
Right. Thank you, Andrea. And for the last question before we turn it to Q&A to the audience, I want to ask you a similar question, Raquel, about the interplay between Black queer feminism, the law, and organizing. Well, you know, just from a different perspective, particularly drawing on your experience with the Transgender Law Center. You were a national organizer at TLC. What is your what can you tell us about your experience at TLC and about that interplay?
Yeah, so I always have to preface my conversations about TLC with the fact that I'm not a lawyer. So also carry that as well.
You're better than a lawyer, Raquel.
Well, thank you. So I mean, when I came into TLC, it really was kind of confronting this legacy of legal work in California, but that was very much focused on whiteness and focused on privilege, right? And so it meant working with other Black folks in the organization and other folks of color there on unpacking what the organization was really saying when it says it's doing the work amongst the most marginalized, right? Or for the most marginalized. And I think everyone should be grappling with what they mean by that, right? It becomes kind of this like, you know, nice sound bite for people in our spaces, but what are you actually saying when you say that? And so for the newer staff that kind of came in, it was a lot of, you know, Black trans folks, a lot of GNC folks of color, a lot of people who are immigrants or from, you know, communities with a lot of immigrants in them. And so we were really grappling with how to find our place in law, right? And this idea of even seeking legal recourse and finding solutions in the legal system is a very white thing, right? Like the people I know aren't, you know, running to try and get a lawyer, possibly because, you know, that takes a lot of resources that a lot of our people don't necessarily have, but also we know what the legal community has historically done to our communities and is still doing to it now. And so that meant bringing in more of this organizing approach and really figuring out with laser-like precision what our programming was going to be doing. And again, I'll also say that work started in some ways before I was even there, right? And so there were people who were already trying to have those conversations. So one of those things that kind of came out of that work with the new crew was the trans immigrant defense effort. And so really focusing a lot on transgender immigrants who were being mistreated in ICE custody or really just kind of in fear of being caught up in raids, all of these different kind of situations. And so if you think of like the situation with Roxana and the Justice for Roxana campaign, that would be a great kind of situation to think of in that context of where we were trying to get resources to communities that were living in fear. One of the problems with that was that there wasn't an emphasis on immigrants from multiple identity groups, right? And so a lot of the great work that has happened with BLMP, the Black LGBTQ plus migrant project that Ola Saze really kind of got off the ground, and a lot of people in BYP like Roseberry and Femi and other folks have really played a part in creating the infrastructure around that project, has really centered Black migrant experiences and made it clear that, you know, when we're talking about oppression, even from an immigration standpoint, the erasure and the silencing of Black voices and experiences in that conversation is palpable and so harmful. And even now, when we think about immigration in a national context, right, we still don't think of Black immigrants from all around the world. So then with that, there was also the project TLC at Song that Mickey Bradford was really instrumental in kind of creating the first iteration of that, which focused on a partnership between Transgender Law Center and Southerners on New Ground, bringing in that organizing legacy and history and expertise from Song and that legal expertise from TLC. And so a lot of the work in the first iteration of that project, because now it's kind of, now there's some work around kind of restructuring what it looks like, but it was focused on elevating the experiences of particularly trans and GNC folks in the South, in rural areas. And so that's where a lot of the conversation deepened around things like decriminalization, and what that means from an HIV standpoint, what that means from even a sex work standpoint, what that means just in terms of transforming the world around TGNC folks that wasn't really built for us, right? And then going forward, before I left, I started Black Trans Circle, and I'm still working with TLC on that now. And so the birth of Black Trans Circles really came out of really just being frustrated at the lethargy and the apathy around the murders of Black trans women and the violence that was happening. And I really was interested in how we kind of focus on the people who are left behind in those communities after those murders happen, right? So that meant really unpacking what that trauma and that harm looks like when Black trans women or Black trans femmes witness this happening in their communities and are feeling really even more vulnerable than they already were. And so it's been great to kind of get that off the ground. We had an amazing convening last year in New Orleans, because in 2017, that year, there were at least 4 murders of Black trans women in New Orleans. 3 of them happened within like a month span in like February of 2017. And so it was really important to focus on areas that had those reported murders in high numbers and figure out where the energy around wanting to transform the communities was there. And so we're gearing up in a different way this year and really pinpointing 3 locations, continuing in New Orleans, going to Ohio and Texas, and really working with a group of trans women and femmes in those areas to come up with what their solutions are going to be around healing. And so that can be anything from focusing on public awareness, whether it's a series of town halls or something like that, or focusing specifically on their own healing and how to get de-escalation training, to Black trans women in their areas. So it's open-ended because I think that it is different. The solutions are different in different locations. Again, I'll also say that that's not something that is new. All of these ideas around theory and Black queer feminism and intersectionality, while the terms may seem more new, right, the energy around these ideals have always been there. And I think about like Marsha P. Johnson, when she was working with Star House and working with Sylvia Rivera on that, they specifically were clear that they wanted to create a space where there was free gender expression, where there was an end to prison injustice and homelessness, and a creation of an inclusive community, rejecting these ideas around gender and sexual identity, right? And so all of that, right, is so much a part of our understanding of intersectionality. And I think it would be a disservice to act like any of that is completely brand new. And then the last thing I'll say is, this is kind of in reference to something Charlene said in her last comment, but this idea around theory being evolving, right? And so when it comes to really trying to come up with these solutions around liberation, we have to be flexible and we have to be open to that evolution around our theories and not being static in them. And so while they may sound brilliant and like expertise in the moment, that may not necessarily be true in the next moment. And we have to be okay with that. And so one thing I've started saying more recently is that I'm okay with being obsolete in the future, right? Particularly around my understanding of oppression and privilege and even my identity. I think in a lot of ways, as a Black trans woman, there's this idea of like, oh, that's, you know, that's like the avant-garde and that it's so radical that you could even get to that point. And I actually don't even think it's radical. Like, I know people who have way more radical conceptions of their identities than I do. And so I'm okay with being obsolete in the future. And I think we all have to kind of grapple with that.
Ashe to everything you just said. Wow, there's just so much there. I want to put it to you, Charlene. You want to add on to that?
I was just saying, there's so much that y'all have said, that, and particularly Raquel, what you said about being open to things evolving. I think how we talk about the Black queer feminist lens is totally incomplete. It's just getting started. You know, like you mentioned Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera's work. Like the predecessors to intersectionality, double jeopardy, triple jeopardy, interlocking oppressions, the Declaration and the question of ain't I a woman? I mean, the things just go on and on and on and on of how long, particularly like our people, Black people, have been theorizing, acting on, flipping, expanding gender, expanding what it means to like live in a world where people can live in their full dignity. Is just super important. And I think every example that Raquel gave about the campaigns and the projects that the Transgender Law Center worked on and that she's worked on, it sits within a hell of a legacy. And that's what like our work is about, like building on what has come before us. And like it's like somebody told me, it's like I don't know if I said it or somebody else said it, about like how Black feminism, so much of it is about like a practice of it is citing other Black women and other Black feminists before us. That's just like a core Black feminist praxis, citing other folks and like just giving a litany of all the people who did this stuff before we did. And even if something like downplaying what we do to talk about what other people did before we did, it's just like a part of the tradition. And like that in and of itself is like, it's just core to the Black queer feminist lens in my view. And then we have to be ready for not just the next generation, but the homies who are 13 right now organizing to say, well, actually, this is what I think it should be. Like that's the work. So I appreciate you for saying that. Like it. Yeah.
Right, and I appreciate all of you. Like this has been such a rich conversation, and I have many questions that I could ask, but I'm not going to be greedy. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience to pose to you all. We have about 15 minutes for a Q&A. So I'm going to start with questions that have already been posed in the chat box. And, you know, if we do have time, we can get to more. So if you have a question right now, go ahead and drop it in the box. Can't guarantee it'll be answered. But one question we have is, do y'all see any limitations to working from a Black queer feminist lens? Is there anything that folks should be aware of as we take this framework in whatever we're doing? And anyone can take that. So I take the silence to mean that there are no limitations in Black queer.
I mean, surely there must be something. I mean, it's application, you know, and we're humans. I think it's in the interpretation and the application of it, you know. That's all I got.
I would agree. I mean, I think first of all, anytime you're working with a concept where people can interpret it differently, you know, you could assume a certain understanding and someone else could assume a certain understanding, and you might not be working from the same position. I do worry about the ways in which kind of queerness is increasingly about people's performance and identity and not about a politics. So, you know, I said that already. And let's see, other things that we should worry about. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, I don't know if other people have other concerns. I think any analysis, you're always kind of questioning, what am I, and I think this goes to the last point. You can have an analysis, but you know your analysis is incomplete. So you're always trying to question, what is right here? What do I need to revise? What do I need to read? How I need to rethink this? So I don't, I think it's all shaky ground. Can I say one last thing, which has nothing to do with this, which is the question of theorizing. And we've all been talking about the kind of ability for lots of people to theorize, Gramsci's organic intellectuals. But, I've heard other speakers on other discussions say this, and I think it's like theorizing around liberation is not necessarily supposed to be easy. That's not to mean it's not, has to be exclusive, but we're struggling for our liberation. And it seems to me that struggle involves that, right? That we have to think hard about what are our connections? How do we understand power? How do we understand resistance? What does deviance look like? Who's on the margins? Why are on the margins? I mean, all of those are not easy subjects that, are readily available to us. That's why we are in community. And it seems to me that the kind of critical nature of theorizing is not its difficulty, but in fact, who are we doing it with? So that in fact, multiple people can help us think about and analyze the situation so we can move forward. So I'm done.
Right, and kind of similarly, and Charlene started to speak to this earlier in the conversation, but in addition to making a daily effort to learn, understand, and develop political and social consciousness, what are some actions that can be taken on a daily basis to undermine the structures of white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy? How can one live in an anti-racist, anti-capitalist way, moving beyond intellectual understanding? So, anyone have thoughts on that? I'll also throw out the other questions, the two questions that we have in the chat box, just in case folks want to tag team. Have a question around the Black Queer Feminist lens and philanthropy. Someone asks, what are our thoughts on applying a Black Queer Feminist lens to structures rooted in white supremacy and racism, such as philanthropy? In the case of philanthropy, how do we go beyond just funding Black-led work? How do we apply a Black Queer Feminist lens to disrupt a system like philanthropy?
I have some thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. So
one, for people who, I think it's twofold, because I know, Shalini, you're in philanthropy, and that even that there's a hell of a task ahead of people who have values that are anti-capitalist, values that are pro-Black, pro-queer, pro any of these things, who work in philanthropy in the United States of America. And so, one, I know the part of your question about what can we do beyond funding, I struggle beyond, like, we got to first get to that place, because not everybody's there. Like, the work that you do, Charlene, like, y'all fund this kind of work, but the vast majority of philanthropy does not fund grassroots organizing. Such a small percentage of grassroots organizing, of philanthropic dollars, goes to our kind of work. We're talking, I don't have the most recent figures, but I'm being generous with less than 20%. That's generous, like less than 10%, I think, of philanthropic dollars go towards our work. So that's a huge, like, hurdle that we have to, like, get through. And if we want to, first of all, it's even a question, right, around funding the work. And I do believe that funders actually should give the money and move out of the way. Like, just move out of the way. Like, that's just such a big part of it. I think for people, like, some things that are useful, I think, for folks who are on the philanthropic side and people who are actually fundraising through those avenues, is to say, what are our fundraising values? Like, what are our actual values? How are we going to approach this thing? Because as a person who's done a lot of fundraising, I approach fundraising not as, like, this is as from a deficit, a standpoint of deficiency, but one of, actually, this is the least risky work that you can fund. Actually, this money, like, you have to spend it in public foundations in the first place. You have to spend it. You have to give it away. And the amount of barriers that exist with in some philanthropic foundations are unconscionable and absolutely absurd. And then I have these experiences in philanthropy that are not ridiculous. So I know it's possible. And oftentimes, y'all, to be honest with you, the people who I've gotten more money from ask for less than the folks who are giving you, like, small grants. They want 12 site visits. They want 12,000 pages of paperwork. And I have had the opportunity to be able to be a part of moving money that was much, much larger with just giving somebody 2 pages of information. And that's it. And so I'm like, applying a Black queer feminist lens to philanthropy requires a fundamental shift in power, which I'm not clear can happen, given the current way that philanthropy is set up when we talk about major foundations and even individual donors who have who go with funds that manage donor dollars or donor resources. It requires a fundamental shift in power, and at minimum, valuing self-determination of groups, moving completely away from project-based funding and focusing on general operating support, and being willing and open to fund things like land-based projects, real support for people who are at various levels of leadership. I could talk about this all day. I probably need to write something on it. But self-determination, fundamental shifts and transformation in power, and getting out of the way and letting people do their work. Because you got to spend the money anyway. So you might as well do it.
Can you please write something on that, actually? That would be great. Another question we have is, how feasible is it to stay committed to working from a Black queer feminist lens while operating in white cishet spaces or organizations?
Let me just say, I think that's some of the easiest reminders of why, in fact, you need to hold on to a Black queer feminist analysis, perspective, community. It is the ways in which white supremacy gets reproduced from folks who don't even understand that they're engaged in the reproduction, right? It is the kind of daily outrages and microaggressions and macroaggressions. It is the ways in which folks don't understand the struggle for dignity, the trauma that our communities are experiencing, the need for resistance. I mean, I work in a predominantly white institution, the University of Chicago. On a daily basis, I am reminded of the need for community and Black queer feminist grounding. So for me, that doesn't mean that everything I do in those spaces represents something we might call Black queer feminism. It means that it frames how I think about the world and the decisions that I try to make, the way I show up in a classroom or the research that I undertake. I think we give each other the recognition that we all are full of contradictions and nuance, but the overall goal is one of being committed to a certain type of liberation and doing our best to work towards that liberation every day. So, yeah.
Thank you, Cathy. And thank you, everyone. I want to be conscious of time. We are nearing the end of our time together. So I just want to highlight, particularly for folks who are on the phone and not on the computer, that there have been some resources, links to resources in the chat box that will also be sent out after this call. Shout out to Andrea and Charlene for dropping some things in there for us. And I want to punt it to Marbre to close us out and give us some information on the next webinar to look out for.
They want to know where your hat is from.
Oh, this
hat.
Very important question. Yes, my hat is a BYP 100 swag. It says Black Queer Feminist Organizing Team. Ow.
Thank y'all so much. That was so juicy and just so powerful. I mean, a lot to think about. So thank y'all for taking the time to sit with us today and have this really important conversation. We will, as Janae said, be sharing the resources, and most of these folks have also written incredibly dope books. So we'll also be sharing links to where you can get those. And again, our next webinar is going to be on the 19th of March on abolition. We also have one coming up next Monday on the Black solidarity economy. So trying to build out what this looks like in praxis. So thank y'all again so much for joining us. Thank you for the panelists and Janae for your incredible moderation. We're super grateful and looking forward to continuing the conversation. Good night, y'all.
Bye, everyone.